You call that a repair?
Maybe stick to changing tires, sweetie.
You know, they say you can't smell a memory, but I beg to differ, because every time I catch a whiff of high-octane fuel mixed with stale coffee and old grease, I'm right back there in Oak Haven, standing in the middle of my father's garage, holding a foreclosure notice that felt heavier than a transmission block. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was an eviction notice for my entire life, a sign that the world was finally done with the Vance family legacy. My name is Riley Vance, and if you're from around Ironwood County, you might remember my dad, Pistol Pete Vance, the man who could tune a carburetor by ear and drive a dirt track like he was dancing with the devil himself. But legends don't pay the electric bill, and glory fades a hell of a lot faster than rust, so when Pop passed away, suddenly, quietly, just slumped over the fender of a '69 Camaro he was restoring, he left me with a heart full of grief and a business drowning in red ink. I was 22, looked about 16, and I had hands that were permanently stained with oil, which apparently made me a target for every vulture in a 3-county radius, but none of them were quite as predatory as Sterling Cross. You know the type, the kind of guy who wears a $3,000 Italian suit to a demolition derby just to show he can, the owner of Crossline Automotive, a soulless chain of dealerships that had been eating up mom-and-pop shops like popcorn. Sterling had been eyeing my dad's lot for years, not because he respected the history, but because we sat on a prime corner lot right off the interstate, and he had visions of a glass and steel service center that would charge people $500 just to plug in a diagnostic computer. He showed up 3 days after the funeral, driving a silver German sedan that probably cost more than my entire inventory, and walked into my shop like he owned the air we were breathing, pinching his nose at the smell of honest work. "Riley, sweetheart," he said, and I swear the way he said sweetheart made my skin crawl like I'd touched a live wire. "Let's be reasonable here. Your father was a charming man, a local character, sure, but he wasn't a businessman, and looking around at this museum of mismanagement, it's clear the apple didn't fall far from the tree." He placed a contract on the workbench, right on top of a grease rag, and tapped it with a manicured finger. "I'm offering you an out, a chance to walk away with a little dignity and enough cash to go to cosmetology school or whatever it is girls your age do when they realize they aren't built for manual labor." I remember gripping a wrench so hard my knuckles turned white, feeling that hot, prickly heat of shame and anger rising up my neck, because the worst part wasn't his arrogance. It was the terrifying thought that he might be right, that maybe I was just a girl playing pretend in a man's world, drowning in debt I couldn't understand. I told him to get out, used a few colorful words my dad had taught me when a bolt wouldn't budge, and Sterling just smiled that cold, shark-like smile and said, "Have it your way, kid, but when the bank takes the keys, I'll buy it at auction for pennies, and I'll bulldoze this rust bucket before the ink is dry." He left, but the silence he left behind was louder than any engine roar, a heavy, suffocating silence that screamed failure. That night, I sat in the dark office, staring at the wall where Dad's old trophies gathered dust, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life, until my eyes landed on something under a top in the far corner of the shop, the Ghost. It was a 1970 Chevy Chevelle SS, a project car Dad and I had been working on since I was tall enough to hold a flashlight, a beast of a machine that we never quite finished, a car that was supposed to be our ticket to the amateur circuit before his heart gave out. I walked over, pulled back the top, and the dust motes danced in the moonlight coming through the skylight, revealing the primer grey body and the empty space where the passenger seat should be. I sat in the driver's seat, wrapped my hands around the cold steering wheel, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. I felt him. I remembered his voice, gravelly and warm, telling me, "Oh, why, the car doesn't know you're a girl, it doesn't know you're broke, and it sure as hell doesn't care what your last name is. It only respects one thing, and that's the truth of your foot on the pedal and your hands on the wheel." That's when I saw the flyer on the passenger floorboard, something Dad must have tossed there weeks ago, the Thunder Creek Regional Championship, grand prize $75,000, enough to pay off the immediate loans and keep the Wolves at bay for at least another year. It was insane. It was impossible. It was a suicide mission for a rookie mechanic with a half-finished car and zero professional racing experience. But desperation has a funny way of making the impossible look like the only option. I called Uncle Skeeter the next morning. Skeeter wasn't my real uncle, just an old Vietnam vet with a bad hip and a genius IQ when it came to combustion engines, the only guy who stuck around after Dad died. When I told him the plan, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into a tin can, looked at me with his one good eye, and said, "You're crazy as a bag of hammers, Riley. So when do we start?" We had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to turn a street-legal muscle car into a track-eating monster. 3 weeks to find parts we couldn't afford. 3 weeks to learn how to drive not just fast, but aggressive. Word got around Oak Haven faster than a blown gasket. And let me tell you, the town's reaction wasn't exactly a ticker-tape parade. I'd go to the hardware store and hear the whispers, "That's the Vance girl, thinks she's gonna race against the big boys, or she's gonna get herself killed, just like her old man almost did a dozen times." It stung, I won't lie, especially when I saw the pity in the eyes of people who used to come to our Sunday barbecues, looking at me like I was a tragedy waiting to happen. But the worst came from Crossline Automotive. Sterling heard about my entry and decided to make an example of me. He entered his own car, a professionally built, fuel-injected, computer-tuned Marvel driven by a hired gun named Jackson the Ace Miller, a guy who had raced semi-pro and had an ego big enough to need its own zip code. Sterling even stopped by the shop again, just to twist the knife, leaning against the doorframe while I was wrestling with a suspension strut. "This is embarrassing, Riley," he sneered, checking his watch. "You're going to go out there in this junk pile and humiliate." I dropped to my knees in the broken glass, feeling the cold morning air rushing in, and for 10 minutes, I just cried. I cried for my dad, for the unfairness of it all, for the sheer cruelty of men like Sterling Cross who thought they could crush people just because they had a bigger bank account. Skeeter put a heavy hand on my shoulder, not saying a word, just letting me grieve. But then, as the sun started to creep over the horizon, hitting the jagged glass on the floor, something shifted inside me. The sadness burned off, evaporated by a heat that rose from my gut, pure, unadulterated rage. I stood up, wiped my face with a dirty sleeve, and looked at the carnage. "We are not done," I whispered, my voice raspy. Skeeter looked at the wreckage and then at me, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face. "Well," he drawled, "I was hoping you'd say that, 'cause I already called in the cavalry." And that's when I heard the trucks pulling up, not tow trucks, but pickup trucks. Old F-150s, rusted Silverados, beat-up sedans. It was the Ghost crew, Dad's old racing buddies, guys I hadn't seen in years, retired mechanics, even a few of the local boys who had heard what happened and were sick of Sterling's bullying. They walked in with toolboxes, welding torches, and coolers of coffee. One of them, a giant of a man named Big Earl, looked at the car and cracked his knuckles. "Heard you got a pest problem, Riley. Let's get this girl ready to dance." It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, a community coming together not for money, not for glory, but because they hated a bully and they loved an underdog. For the next 72 hours, nobody slept. We flushed the fuel system, rewired the ignition, replaced the glass with plexiglass, and hammered out the dents. We didn't just fix her, we made her meaner. When we loaded the Chevelle onto the trailer the morning of the race, she looked like something out of a Mad Max movie. Primer gray, scars visible, a patchwork of parts, but she was alive. We rolled into Thunder Creek Speedway just as the sun was hitting the track, and the atmosphere was electric, smelling of burnt rubber and anticipation. The pits were crowded with high-end trailers, crews in matching uniforms, and tech that looked like it belonged to NASA. Then there was us, a beat-up dually truck pulling a flatbed with a Frankenstein muscle car, followed by a convoy of ragtag locals. As we unloaded, the silence rippled through the paddock. Then came the laughter. I heard it, distinct and sharp. "Look at that heap," someone shouted. "Did she build that in the dark?" Sterling Cross was there, of course, standing next to his pristine blue and silver racer, looking like he was at a yacht club mixer. He walked over, flanked by his driver Jackson, and shook his head with mock sympathy. Riley, I heard about the break-in. Terrible tragedy. I assumed you'd have the sense to stay home. You know, these safety inspections are rigorous. I'd hate to see you get flagged before you even start." He was gloating, practically admitting he knew about the sabotage, his eyes dancing with malicious delight. I stepped right into his personal space, smelling his expensive cologne masking the rot of his soul. "Save your concern for your transmission, Sterling," I said, my voice steady as a rock. "Because looking at this track, it's going to be a rough day for pretty things." The drivers' meeting was a blur of testosterone and side eyes. There were 25 drivers, 24 men, and me. The official, a guy who looked like he'd been chewing the same cigar since 1980, went over the rules, but I could feel the eyes boring into the back of my neck. When they called the roll, Car 17, Riley Vance, there was a smattering of polite applause and a few whistles, but mostly just a heavy skepticism. I was the carnival sideshow, the mechanic's daughter playing dress-up. But as I zipped up my fire suit, Dad's old suit, which I had tailored to fit, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't Riley the girl who owed the bank money anymore. I was the pilot of the Ghost. Qualifying was a nightmare. The track was slicker than usual, and my first lap was sloppy, the car fighting me in the turns, the rear end wanting to break loose. I could hear the announcer's voice over the PA system, dripping with condescension. Looks like the Vance car is having trouble finding the groove, folks. Maybe that horsepower is a bit too much to handle. I gritted my teeth, ignored the noise, and focused on the vibration of the steering wheel. I talked to the car. Come on, old girl, don't embarrass me now. Grip. Just grip. On the third and final qualifying lap, I stopped fighting her and let her run loose, drifting the corners dirt track style on the asphalt. We crossed the line. And Vance posts a surprising time, putting her in 8th position. Not bad for a rookie. 8th. Mid-pack. It wasn't pole position, but it was enough to be in the fight. Sterling's car, naturally, qualified 2nd. As I sat in the pits waiting for the main event, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. Skeeter leaned in the window, his face grim. Listen to me, RY. They're gonna try to box you in. They're gonna bump you. They think you'll flinch. Don't you dare flinch. I looked at the photo of my dad taped to the dashboard, his smile wide and confident. I won't, I promised. The call came to start engines. The roar was deafening, a physical force that rattled your ribs. I turned the key, and the Chevelle exploded to life, a raw, angry idol that sounded like thunder trapped in a tin can. We rolled out onto the track, the heat shimmering off the asphalt, 25 Predators circling, waiting for the green flag to drop. I gripped the wheel, took a deep breath of exhaust fumes, and whispered, "Okay, Dad. Let's show him what we got." The green flag dropped like a guillotine, and the world dissolved into chaos. You think you know loud. You don't know loud until you're sandwiched between 24 V8 engines screaming at redline, fighting for the same 10 feet of asphalt into turn 1. The car in front of me, a neon green Mustang, checked up early, and I had to slam the brakes, the Chevelle's nose diving, my seatbelt locking hard against my chest. Someone clipped my rear bumper, a hard, intentional shove that sent me fishtailing toward the outer wall. The crowd gasped. I could feel it more than hear it, but instinct took over. I counter-steered, feathered the throttle, and felt the tires bite back into the track, correcting the slide just inches from the concrete. My heart was hammering a drum solo against my ribs, but I was alive. I was still in the race. By lap 10, the field had stretched out, but the intensity hadn't dropped an ounce. I was stuck in a pack of mid-tier cars, guys who drove like they had nothing to lose and everything to prove. I saw the way they looked at me in their mirrors. They weren't racing a driver, they were blocking a girl. Every time I tried to pass on the inside, a door would slam shut. Every time I looked outside, they'd drift up to cut my air. It was frustrating, suffocating. I could hear Skeeter in my earpiece, his voice crackling through the static. Patience, RY. Let 'em burn their tires up. You drive your line. Wait for the mistake. So I waited. I fell into a rhythm, ignoring the red mist of anger, focusing on the tachometer and the apex of every turn. One by one, they started to slip up, a missed shift here, a wide turn there, and each time, the Ghost and I were there to pounce. By lap 30, I had clawed my way up to 5th place. The leaders were ahead, a tight knot of 3 cars, including Jackson in Sterling's blue and silver missile. I was closing the gap, but then the car started to talk to me, and it wasn't saying nice things. The oil temperature gauge began to creep up, ticking past 210, then 220. The abuse, the heat, the constant high RPMs were taking a toll on the engine we had rebuilt with duct tape and prayers. Skeeter, I yelled over the radio, she's running hot. Needles climbing. There was a pause, a heavy silence where I knew he was calculating the odds of the block cracking. Ease off on the straights. RY short shift. If she blows, she blows. But don't you park it unless you see flames. That was the permission I needed. I wasn't stopping. I nursed the car, giving up precious speed on the straightaways to save the engine, then diving into the corners like a kamikaze to make up the time. It was a dangerous dance, teetering on the edge of control. With 5 laps to go, a crash took out the 4th place car, a spectacular spin into the infield that brought out a yellow flag. This was it. The field bunched up. The restart. I was in 4th, right behind the lead pack. I could see Jackson's helmet in the car ahead, looking back at me. I knew Sterling was on his radio right now, telling him to put me in the wall if I got close. Green flag. The final sprint. The car ahead of me, a veteran racer named Old Man Miller, had a bad restart, his tire spinning. I shot past him on the inside, the Chevelle roaring in triumph. Third place. I was on the podium. I could have stayed there, played it safe, taken the check and gone home a hero. But then I saw Jackson ahead in second place, struggling. His car was fast, but his tires were shot. He had pushed too hard, too early, arrogant enough to think the race was won. He was sliding in the turns, blocking aggressively. I came up on his bumper coming out of turn 2, filling his rearview mirror with primer grey nightmare. He swerved to block, and I feinted left, then dove hard right, a crossover move my dad had famous for, the Vance slingshot. Jackson panicked. He jerked the wheel to block the right side, but his worn tires gave up. His rear end washed out, the blue and silver car sliding sideways up the track. I threaded the needle, shooting the gap between his spinning car and the inside curb with inches to spare. The crowd erupted, a roar that drowned out the engines. I was in second. The leader was too far gone, a quarter lap ahead, but it didn't matter. I crossed the finish line with the temperature gauge buried in the red and smoke trailing from the exhaust, screaming inside my helmet until my throat was raw. I had done it. Second place. But in that moment, it felt like I had won the Indy 500. Bringing the car into the pits was a blur. People were running toward me, my crew, the ghost crew, jumping the wall, high-fiving, crying. Big Earl lifted me out of the car like I weighed nothing, spinning me around. You did it, girl. You showed 'em. I looked for Skeeter, and found him leaning against the tool cart, wiping his eye with a greasy rag. He just nodded at me, a sharp, crisp nod of respect that meant more than any trophy. Then the cameras descended. The local news, sports reporters, everyone wanted a piece of the mechanic's daughter who drove a junker onto the podium. But the real moment, the movie moment, happened when I saw Sterling cross. He was standing near his hauler, his face a mask of fury as his driver limped the car back to the pits with flat-spotted tires. Sterling saw me looking, and for a second, he looked like he wanted to storm over and scream. But he couldn't. The cameras were rolling. The crowd was chanting my name. He had to swallow it. He gave a stiff, tight jerk of his head and turned his back, retreating into his luxury trailer. That was the victory. Not the trophy, but the fear in his eyes, the realization that he couldn't buy this. The interview was a frenzy. A reporter shoved a microphone in my face. Riley, you were the underdog, the only woman, driving a car held together by hope. How does it feel to beat the big money team? I took a breath, looked straight into the camera lens, and thought about the foreclosure notice, the insults, the sugar in the tank. It feels good, I said, my voice steady. But let's get one thing straight. I didn't beat them because I'm a woman, and I didn't beat them because I got lucky. I beat them because at Vance Garage, we don't buy performance, we build it. And to everyone who thinks you can push the little guy around just because you have a checkbook, well, you better check your rearview mirror, because we are coming. The fallout was immediate. The next morning, the line of cars waiting for service at Vance Garage stretched down the block. People didn't just want their oil changed, they wanted to shake my hand. They wanted to be part of the story. The bank called, suddenly very willing to renegotiate the loan terms now that I was a local celebrity with prize money in the bank. We paid off the immediate debt, bought new tools, and even gave the shop a fresh coat of paint. But the sweetest part came a week later. I was under the hood of a Ford pickup when a shadow fell over me. I slid out on the creeper and looked up to see Sterling cross. He looked different, less polished, tired maybe. He didn't sneer this time. He looked around the busy shop, listening to the hum of impact wrenches and the laughter of my crew. You've created quite a stir, Riley, he said, keeping his hands in his pockets. My sponsors, they're unhappy with the image of my team losing to a rust bucket, as they put it. They love your story, though. The underdog. He took a breath, like the words tasted like vinegar. I'm here to offer you a seat. Drive for Crossline. Proper equipment, a salary, full sponsorship. You'd never have to worry about a mortgage again. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag, and let the silence hang there. It was everything I should have wanted. Security. A career. An easy life. I looked at the check he was holding, It was a number that could fix everything instantly. Then I looked at the ghost, sitting in the corner, battered but proud. I looked at Skeeter, watching me from the office door. I looked at the photo of Dad on the wall. "That's a generous offer, Sterling," I said quietly. "But you're missing the point. I don't race for a brand. I race for this." I gestured to the shop. "But, if you're worried about your image, I have a different idea." I laid out my terms. No job. No buyout. Instead, a partnership. He would drop the plans for the mega service center next door. Instead, we would use the land to build a community tech school and racing academy, the Vanscross Institute. He brings the funding and the corporate connections. I bring the know-how, the heart, and the credibility. "You get to look like the benevolent hero investing in the community," I told him, leaning against the workbench. "And I get to make sure the next generation of mechanics knows how to actually fix a car, not just replace a module. And you stay the hell out of my garage." He stared at me for a long time, calculating, weighing the PR win against his ego. Finally, he let out a short, dry laugh. "Your father was a stubborn mule, Riley. I see he taught you well." He extended a hand. "Deal." 6 months later, the ground broke on the new school. I still run the garage, still get grease under my fingernails every single day. The ghost is retired now, parked in the lobby of the new school as a reminder that it doesn't matter what you start with, it matters what you do with it. On the 1-year anniversary of the race, I went out to Dad's grave. It was a quiet evening.